Today we have a talk on, how we call God, what we call God. I did a version of this in 2020. I've got a different name for it now because I did some more work with it. So I entitled it Big Sweety, and that was after the late Reverend Helen Street, who some of you may remember. And what do you call God? If you're in the 2020s, spiritual centers don't even use the word God so much anymore. Younger generations are comfortable or more comfortable with words like source. Some more scientific would say creative intelligence. What's another one? What? Universe works for a lot of people. Energy seems to work with the kids, so we're trying to, get with it and get into the 2020s ourselves. If I use some of the words that were taught to me, I'd have people probably running out of here because we had all kinds of phrases and names when I was younger. So we're going to talk about how we approach the notion of God or the idea of God, the names, people's perceptions and thoughts about that subject. I'm a product of many things, many trainings, many books, many teachers. I also entered a 12-step program 42 years ago. And in 12-step groups, God is referred to as higher power. Okay? And it was genius when they created the 12-step programs, because in the third step, they when talking about God, if you can imagine such a diverse group of people coming into any of the 12-step programs, the one subject that would be troubling to everyone would be the notion, because everyone has a different idea of what it is. And so they referred to it, God, and then they underlined in the third step, as we understand. So as however you understand God to be. Because we would never tell you, what it looks like or what it is. And we will tell you things about how to approach this whole subject in our teaching, especially in the textbook in the first 4 chapters, which you'll hear me say in the body of this lesson that we typically talk about during the first 4 weeks of the year. We usually do the first 4 chapters of the textbook, and Ernest Holmes refers to God as it, which was very startling to me when I first came into this teaching. So, but in the 12-step programs, when I was, 42 years ago, I found people referring to this as a higher power. Today, I would probably call it an inner power. But that's me 42 years later. The thing that was beautiful about that is people had all different kinds of ideas, and they could approach the universe and have their own relationship, describe it any way they want to. I had a friend all those years ago whose name was Glenn. He was a taxi cab driver, and he was kind of a character. And he used to describe this creative source as Snoopy. And I remember that distinctly because I used to be slightly irritated with him because he was always in the meetings talking about Snoopy, and I thought that was somehow demeaning the whole thing. But it was his thing, right? And so why not, right? I'm different than I was then. I would listen to people like that, I would judge them, and what the hell, because I thought he was making fun of it all. Snoopy was the name he used. He chose to describe this eternal presence that we approach in our teaching. We recognize and we know there is this thing, right? And that it responds to us. And then there was another guy, Lenny. Lenny was someone who meditated in the park every morning at daybreak. And he probably was one of the more spiritual people I've ever known, because everything about him was God. And I remember him talking about, his spiritual practices, which were communing with nature, quieting himself, and he would go down to Young Circle, which was a few blocks from where I used to live, and he would get his Dunkin' Donuts coffee. the crack of dawn, and he would sit there and he'd watch the squirrels. And he just delighted in watching the squirrels. And he says, I find everything I ever need to know about God in those squirrels. So go figure. Other people will, we come out of the Transcendental movement, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and all that group, they spend an awful lot of time talking about experiencing this wonderment, this sense of the divine in nature. Other people have told me when they spend time with very young children, they just see the joy and the beauty, and it just fills them up with a sense of remembrance and a sense of, I guess the word would be wonderment. Some years after that, I met a great teacher. His name was Dr. Bill. We referred to him as Dr. Bill T. And he was giving a powerful talk on a famed columnist. Sometimes I speak of some of these columnists of another generation. Irma Bombeck I used to quote a lot when I was facilitating church groups years ago, because she always had some humor to interject into everyday life. There was another columnist who was famous also. His name was William Edelin, and he approached some of the more thorny questions, the things that were current in all his columns. And he inspired me a little bit today. He had hundreds of columns and several books that they're worth digging up if you can find them. They're out of print, but they're really thought-provoking. So I'm going to use a little bit of his thoughts today. When I encountered some of this type of thinking, I was probably in my early 20s. I came out of a Christian background, in fact, a Catholic, where I went to daily school in a Catholic Catholic school, and we really had to attend Mass before the school day started. It was somewhat mandatory. So there I was at, I think, 7 or 7:30 in the morning every day on my knees. And I began to realize, as I was learning when I was younger, whatever people were talking about in terms of God, they were all talking about the same thing. I started to understand that there's dogma of different kinds in every faith. Everybody got something. Our family had a whole bunch of rituals. I'm sure most of you had some also. And I found as I got older, my parents weren't practicing this stuff so much, but when I was a kid, everybody was religious. I don't know why they were, how they were, but they were. And my grandparents were even more so. So in my 20s, I found the 12-step programs, and I started to hear all these wonderful people. I used to think crazy people, but wonderful people approaching the whole idea of this creative thing, this intelligence, this God, in different ways. And I found, before I found religious science, I was at a Unity church, and Unity was good for me for a while because Unity was, in those days at least teaching their Sunday lessons using Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, but also using the New Testament, and they were using it, teaching New Thought principles. So that was very helpful, because if you've come out of a very Catholic background, you've got a lot of stuff to unpack. And Unity was very helpful because they would take the same stories and they would interpret them from a New Thought perspective. And while there, well, not that Unity church, but the one I went to next when I moved to Miami, Florida, there was a marquee was put up on the church that week, which said, "You can heal your life." And very coincidentally, someone had given me a tape for somebody else. And I started to go there and participate. And here I'm teaching the same class every Thursday night that I was back in 1987. So this has been an ongoing phenomena in my life. Louise Hay presented us with certain ideas that were important. And she was teaching science of mind to what I'll say a mass audience, an audience that had never been taught before. because Ernest Holmes was phenomenal. The Science of Mind textbook is amazing, and all of his books, he's got like at least 6 or 8, I don't know the real number. Not a problem, but his audience was his audience, and it wasn't growing and growing. And Louise Haight, when she published that book, 66 million copies were sold, and she was on the New York Times bestseller list at least twice. And it goes down as being one of the best-selling books of most of our lifetimes, at least in when it comes to this type of material. So Louise's thing was 2 things, really: self-acceptance and self-approval. She said were the keys to all positive changes. And you remember her saying, I've talked to thousands of people. She went everywhere with her material, right? And she listened to people, and she said you can really distill it all down. Most people's problems come down to there's some aspect of themselves that there's a disconnect with. They're not approving of themselves. They're not accepting themselves. They're thinking, I'm not good enough. I failed in this, in my marriage, in my job, or I failed somewhere. I'm no longer looking like I used to look. So we have this thing. There seems to be a need for us to denigrate ourselves, say that we're missing the boat and all that stuff. And she said we hold ourselves to impossible standards. And she says, now we all know who are really in this teaching. We know how it happens. It happens when we're kids. We're really wonderful. We come in as these beings of light, she would say, And when we laugh, everybody around us will laugh and take care of us. And when we cry, everyone gives us attention. So she said we were pretty good as kids in getting our needs met. But as we get a little bit older, we're not so good at that. We learn to stuff it, not talk about it, put on our best look and tough it out. And we're not terribly good always at nurturing ourselves. And so that's another journey altogether. As you come into this teaching, the things you're going to do is you're going to start to work on your inner dialogue. You're going to start to pay attention to what you say to yourself, because we're going to teach you week by week. Can't do it all in one Sunday. We're going to teach you week by week just to start to pay attention to what it is that you're saying to yourself throughout your days, throughout your weeks, because those thoughts are creative. And a lot of that stuff that circulates within me, or probably within most of us, represents old tapes, old programming, stuff we got from our parents, our grandparents. We don't even know where we got some of this stuff. But if it's not life-giving and it's circulating, we understand it's very creative. So we can learn to use this teaching constructively. We can self-correct, alter, challenge the negative thoughts, right? And we can replace the negative thoughts with life-giving thoughts. And it's worth every bit of effort, because we have this mirroring type of activity that goes on with us. Whatever goes on in my consciousness, and my consciousness is the totality of my thoughts. It's my conscious things I'm thinking here with you right here today, but it's all that stuff that's been buried underneath me for decades. Much of it, in my case, I've neutralized. I've worked with. I've learned how to say cancel, stop. I release the need for this. I release the need for that. And I will go into my own internal process, and I will change the lesser thought that I'm harboring for the greater. So what we teach here is a practice, right? And it's, for those who are, I hate to use this word devout, but for those of us who are devout or focused enough to keep redirecting the conversation, you're going to have results, and it'll happen. It won't, even though it may have taken you 20, 30, 40 years to be where you are, you'll have results quicker than you think. But back in those days, I was focused on self-acceptance and self-approval as being the keys to all positive changes. And I also noticed it's very critical. I would be in groups and places, and I could see everything that was wrong and missing. So there was an aspect of me that was extremely judgmental. And I didn't realize that I was projecting that upon everybody else. See, I could see the flaws in everybody, and I wasn't too good at seeing the flaws in myself. And I think that's a challenge for people. Louise Hay will address directly in her book, our need to criticize. And she'll say it really starts with us. When we pay attention to all of our command phrases like I should do this, I should do that, I should have done this, I should have done that, and then see if you're really good at doing that type of thing, beating yourself up with everything you think you should have done, most likely you're doing the same thing to the world you live in. So it means you have all these very strong opinions, and they tend to be critical, and they don't help you. They don't help you at all, and they don't help you. Usually what happens is you read her book, she'll say it's, and I joked with it when I first saw it, she actually said, you might take a moment and notice if you use the word should 47 times a day. She said that it's an indication that you have some rigid patterns within you. And I laughed when I first heard it because she nailed me. I use that word all over the place. You should, you've got to, you must. And the thing is, I thought, okay, Greg, that's really, you're being rough on yourself here. But then logically it follows. If I have all those strong opinions where I'm essentially saying I'm not good enough, then logically, if that's my inner stuff, then I'm going to be projecting those very same ideas upon others. No matter if I'm expressing it to them or not, I'm still thinking it. So as you get involved in this teaching, that's something I'm just pointing out. It's not really the main point of today's talk, but it's just to begin to monitor your thinking. That's the purpose of the Thursday night class that we have every week at 7 p.m. Learning to love ourselves, learning to change those conversations around. And as we do, our life will start to reflect the changes that we're making. Because if I can release the need to do some of that stuff and that type of thinking and replace the lesser for the greater, it will definitely start to shape up my life in a more positive way. So, my notes. I was learning to judge less, to take it easy. That was a mantra from the spiritual recovery programs. Take it easy. Easy does it. Quit criticizing myself. And I was beginning to develop a deeper faith that no matter how anything shows up in my day-to-day life, all is truly well. So whatever happens in your life, I was starting to see it as not that I loved it all, some of the things that came up, but everything was there for me. It was a stepping stone to a greater awareness. And as you get in this teaching more, you'll start to understand that more. There's a line I borrowed from the Course in Miracles, which I studied years ago, and it said it takes great awareness, I think, to understand that all events, circumstances, and happenings are helpful. And so all events, circumstances, and happenings are helpful. And the thing is, so we understand in this teaching that we live, we move, we have our being in this divine stuff that we're trying to describe today. And it takes great awareness to understand that everything that's happening, it's all God in action. And so it takes, again, from that quote, great awareness to understand that all events, circumstances, and happenings are helpful. A person who embraces that teaching is really starting to live a metaphysical life because you're starting to understand more and more that there is this thing, the presence. And there's not an absence, there's it, right? And it's here, and it's in you, and it's operating through you. And it's in all of us. So as you start to take on that realization, then you're becoming a little bit less warlike because you're going to understand that everyone around you is a spiritual being. And however they're showing up, and sometimes they don't show up, sometimes you think, oh my God, what's going on with this person? But whoever they are, wherever you find them, they are a spiritual being that's evolving the same way we all are. So I was getting ready in those days. I had a pretty keen spiritual sense before I found Science of Mind, but Science of Mind was amazing because I met the right teacher who helped me provide structure for all of this. Because I was able to demonstrate things. I knew I could. If I kept my consciousness in a certain way, things would start to shift. So I knew that before I found my first Science of Mind class. But I did encounter this teacher, Dr. Bill, and I thought he was one of the clearest New Thought teachers of his time. And he was certainly perfect for me. When he was talking about a law and a love that's operating always in the universe, I was at the time coming out of a whole fog of beliefs. He was saying everything that this creative energy is, some call it love, he said it always operates according to law. We have two big banners here, which we say, love points the way. So there's this thing within you that you can commune with, this spirit that if you do commune with it, it will inspire you. It might be in your dreams, it could be in your aha moments, but it's there, it's within you, and I believe it's always trying to get your attention. And so that love will point the way, and then the law makes the way possible. And what that really is simply saying is the whole universe responds to you. You may not think it does, but if you're a real negative thinker, I promise you, if you've got that Chicken Little consciousness, which means the sky is falling, if that's what you maintain, I don't want to get too close to you because every calamity will seem to come your way, and in contrast, if you're a person that has developed a consciousness that would suggest that you're living the affirmative life, which is like you're here to see the good, and that is your focus. If your focus is to see the good, you will see the good, you will experience the good. But that's a practice thing. If you've got 20, 30 years of programming, which is, a mix of negative and positive, then like most of us, you have some work to do. And that really ties right back to paying attention to the conversation, which I say, the conversation that matters most, it's the conversation that you're having with yourself. So in those days when I was approaching Science of Mind, I was coming out of a fog of the guilt that I had for everything. And when I came out of the Catholic religion, I'm hating to take shots at it, I don't mean to. I had such a sense of guilt about everything. And wherever you are with that, you want to start working on it because it will help you. I started to understand more and more. I was realizing more and more that life is responding to me. That's the one thing I knew before I found the teaching. I learned that through Unity. I learned that through Louise. And when I came to Science of Mind, I really started to understand it better. And I hope everybody on the call now is discovering that they have this power. And if you haven't yet discovered it, stay tuned in. The Thursday classes in particular are wonderful because they keep reminding you of how great you are, the power you possess, and how to use it. My teacher, Dr. Bill, explored the first 4 chapters of the textbook to us, and it's something that we traditionally do most years. If you come from a particularly religious family, the chapters could be absolutely startling to you because we used to approach God, we would genuflect, we would bow, we would cross ourselves, we would do all kinds of stuff, right? And that's just my tradition. And if you come from a Judeo-Christian Islam, it will be different. You'll have different rituals, but there'll be a lot of reverence and different ways you approach it. But when I encountered this textbook, which is to my right, and they're talking about God as the thing, I wanted to bless myself as soon as I heard that. There's going to be lightning in this church. And then we talk about the way it works. I think they're referring to the Holy of Holies as it here again. It's like just too much for me to take in. And what it does. See, in the old days, people would approach God with, you heard the phrase, fear and trembling. This is a whole different idea. Now we're talking about what it does, how it works, how to use it. So I could feel goosebumps when I hear him speak, or I could feel them, I could sense them, and it was exciting, and I admit it was a little bit jarring. And people come to us now, they sign on to our calls, and they're like, oh my God, what the hell are they talking about in this place? Because they're steeped in this, different types, they're steeped in a lot of dogma from a lot of religions. So it was exciting for me, jarring. And even I was somewhat of a metaphysical junkie when I found this teaching. I mean, I was reading everything. I was going everywhere, wherever there was anything spiritual, any kind of book. If I could take a bus or a plane, I would be there for whoever the guru was, whoever the person was, I wanted to know. When I finally found Louise Hay and I found this teaching, then I started to get centered, and I realized that this whole thing that we're on, they say it's a journey without a distance, meaning everything that you're looking for is within you, okay? So I was always on a bus or a plane or someplace to try to get somebody, Remember Tina Turner singing a song years ago, we don't need another hero, right? But I was always looking for one. And when you come into a teaching like this and you start to resonate to what we teach, you realize, my God, I really don't have to go anywhere. So it's a journey without a distance. The metaphysical junkie that I was, meaning I was looking everywhere, I started to slow that down a little bit, and I got centered. I knew that there were a lot of great authors. I had read a lot of books. I've learned different types of meditation techniques. I was heavily involved in yoga and the Course in Miracles, and I learned a lot from a lot of places, and I learned some stuff that was very strange too. When I discovered the book, You Can Heal Your Life, as I already talked about, I was working with that material with groups of people. I actually had 2 groups going a week. One was with people who had AIDS, and another was just with regular, everyday people who had healing challenges. And I learned so much, and I saw so much, and I saw healing is possible, and I saw healing happen. Didn't happen for everybody, but it happened for a lot of people. And even when the healing wasn't like a complete physical healing or restoration, there was a certain degree of peace, and I don't know, people had something. They had a sense of knowing that things were okay, and they weren't terrified anymore, and there was a peace. And I had a partner who died in 1990, and people used to say, well, this guy's become Jesus-like. I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, he's just filled with peace and joy. Everybody wants to be around him. And that's because eventually he embraced what this teaching's all about. He, every hand that touches him, he would say, is a healing hand. And then I was next working with a group of women who had AIDS for a couple years, and their children did too. And so that was quite a thing to observe. And I saw transformations of every kind. I got more involved with the Science of Mind teaching with this great teacher. So Science of Mind helped shape it up for me. And I was asked to continue with the healing work with the Louise Hay group. And really that group has never stopped. I think I've done it every week since 1987. Now here in New York, it continues. I never had an idea that I would be at First Church where Louise Hay started out. I could have never known. In those early days, I knew people could heal. I absolutely knew it. I knew there were physical healings of all kinds. I understood that there was a healing power and presence, and that it worked. And I had read enough and I had experienced enough. But again, I didn't have the structure, so I didn't know how to use the power. Everything, including the Louise Hay material which I was facilitating, everything was preparing me for this character, Dr. Bill, and this powerful teaching. There was a time, whenever I thought about God, I was blessing myself, and whenever I heard anybody doing anything, I had this superstitious notion that yes, it works, but there's still a God up there someplace, right? And so I'd be on my knees praying sometimes and genuflecting, and I would be doing foxhole prayers still. Now, does everybody know what a foxhole prayer is? You don't know? Yeah, well, a foxhole is like if you're in the service, in the army, and you're at war, and you're kind of like dug in. You're in a battle, and you're praying to God because this might be it. So it's kind of like, it's an expression. It's like, dear God, please help me. I will never do whatever it is again. I would please just help me from this. Let this pass. So I was pretty good at doing foxhole prayers. I remember when I was a teenager, I had drank too much. And my uncle picked me up, and thank God, and it wasn't my father. And I'm praying, because I didn't know what was going to happen, and I'm saying, if you do this, if you help me, I will never, that type of thing. That's a foxhole prayer. Or you might have someone in your life that's sick, and you might be praying, and those are points of desperation kind of prayers. People pray, when they pray that way, they're praying for something outside of them, and you're saying, dear God, please give me, dear God, please help me. And then sometimes some people will promise to do something in return. You might have done something similar in your life. I'm sure some of you have. And again, I was going to mass every day before school. I think I was an altar boy. I know I was for a while. So if you could imagine, when I encountered this guy, Dr. Bill Tolliver, a few years later, speaking of the creative intelligence as being a thing, I'm thinking, my God, he's calling the holy, what we called the Holy of Holies, an it. It seemed like a lot. It seemed sacrilegious. So let me move more into the present with the teaching. It is a very impersonal word. When you're thinking of source, God, creative intelligence, it is very impersonal. And because it's so impersonal, Dr. Holmes probably chose it, right? It's not a person. It's beyond any idea of person. In a number of the courses I've taken over the years, I've heard many different words to describe what most people in, I'll say, America or the West commonly call God. The Christian faith describes God as many things, but the one I hear most is the unified Trinity, and they're speaking of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. My interpretation of that, of course, is one source with three aspects within the one source. And if that's your way of experiencing, if that's your way of dealing or sensing with the presence, I think it's valid for you, because we don't tell anybody, how to pray, really. We can teach you how to do affirmative prayer or spiritual mind treatment, which is very effective. But, we don't tell you what to do. We don't have any dogma here. My courses, when I took a master's program, often referred to this higher power as that which cannot be described, or that which can't be adequately named. There's another minister that I know that refuses to try to name it. He says always, the presence that's never an absence. That's the way He always tried to describe it. The presence that's never an absence. This energy, God if you will, is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. So that's a good image, so if you can try to pull it into your brain. If you're thinking of this creative intelligence, a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. So that just speaks of infinity in every way, any way you can think about it. If you can imagine that. That one's been around for hundreds of years. I Googled this weekend, and there were hundreds of words and names just coming in out of the Judeo-Christian system that describe God. And then I didn't have the time, because if you go over to people like in the Hindu religion, they absorb all the gods that have ever been. So you could have thousands if you were to look up the names for God. But just doing a cursory quick search, the ones I kind of liked, my top 10 is the magnificent, the loving, the patient, the provider, the one. Most of us would resonate to that more. The one, the ever-living, the absolute, the compassionate, the omnipresence, the presence. And how do you approach it? I'll ask that to all of you. You maybe can share afterwards. Today we don't have a lot of time for sharing, because we're going to do another broadcast. We're doing a series of classes, but we will have some time for sharing. How do you approach it? One of my friends says, hello, power within each day, looking at their eyes. Dr. Barker was famous for he was our founder, in the mirror, just giving himself a big smile and talking to himself each morning. Louise hated a lot of work with mirrors too. She wanted you to connect with yourself, and she had different things. First of all, don't avoid yourself. Look at yourself. And sometimes you do that, you go, oh my God. But no, get past that and look at yourself. And say, hey, beautiful, I love you. Because the thing is, if you can connect with yourself and start to do that, boy, you're going to do a lot of self-healing. Dr. Barker, as you've heard me talk about in past lessons, is what do you say after hello when you get up? What is that conversation starting? Are you there to exuberantly greet the dawn and prepare yourself to have a good day? Slow yourself down a little bit, meditate, and start with a little gratitude, a little positivity. It can set the tone for the day. Many of us, though, if we go back to our youth, hold on to a picture of this powerful entity, usually a male, in the sky, and in the heavens, and we somehow create it to be of human form. I don't know why. And some, though always a smaller number, think in terms of a goddess. I've listened to people for years, but generally it's a guy. I don't know why. Probably it's our training, our background, many of us. There's been many hundreds of religions that have borrowed from one another. Most everything in the Christian religion that I'm aware of was borrowed from other religions. And I'm sure that's true. You think of the religions that have existed. Humankind's been on the planet it changes all the time. I think 50,000 years, but who knows, maybe longer. And everybody approached this eternal power, this presence, in some way, shape, or form or another. And it's evolved over time. And again, religions have borrowed from other religions. Most people in the world will acknowledge that there's something greater than themselves. I think most of us do anyway. And they will believe that there is an intelligence operating in life, through life. After that, people start to wildly disagree on what this thing is. And there's every kind of religion that people are drawn to, many kinds of philosophies. Usually after a period of months or years, here, as people gather every Thursday and they get into this teaching, after a while, most of our students come to the awareness that whatever picture that they had of this God when we're kids was passed on to them by their parents and their grandparents. And most often they accepted it. And it could be Buddha. If you grew up in a certain part of the world, that would be very natural. It could be Christ. It could be the Christ child. The Hindu religion is fascinating with all of its gods and goddesses. There are so many you can't count them. And any of the people grown up in any of these different faiths would have embraced them. And there have been prophets, there have been saints. So when you come to a place like this, at a center, a spiritual center, a New Thought center, and you start to realize that whatever force that there is has to be equally present and available to everyone everywhere. Now, some people have never heard of Ernest Holmes, Louise, Hay, or anything else, Christianity, and they have an authentic relationship with this same thing that we do, called by another name. The name isn't so much important. The cultures through history have taken over religious beliefs. The story of mankind is like a people take over another people. You go back to Rome and you go back to ancient civilizations. They've absorbed what was before always. So the cultures through history have taken over religious beliefs and they blended them many times. Some, though fewer and fewer, some are holding on to anthropomorphic ideas of God, which and that process is in your mind, God is human-like, and there's a tendency to think of it as a man or a woman, and to look at it, and usually there's a sense that it's above you. And so, if you look at the word anthropomorphic, many of you know the word, which means ascribing human characteristics to non-human things. So when we come into our teaching where Ernest Holmes talks about the word it to describe this creative intelligence, it does not have human characteristics. So we may have difficulty in totally understanding what it is. We do our best. Language has its limitations. We use what works best for us. We use what we have, and you can call it whatever you want to call it. Today's title of today's talk was Big Sweety. You can call it Big Sweety. When I say have fun with it, I'm not trying to say make light of it, but it's in you and operating through you. So understand that you have this power within you. As we evolve, as we grow and we grow up in our own lifetimes, many of the ideas and phrases evolve too. Our relationships with this source changes. Certainly with me, I was on my knees all the time. Please help me. I don't do that anymore. I kind of have an understanding that all is well. And that's what Louise Hay taught. And when things are tough, I still know all is well. I know that there is God in this. I know that there is good in this. And that was a gift that I got from Edwina Gaines. She synonymously used the words good and God. Everything she would see is good and God. And then I understand we are cause to our own experience here. So what does that mean? We draw in all kinds of experiences, and sometimes they're not fun, but they're always there for us to cause us to learn and grow. So on a humorous note, I told you before, the late Helen Street called this power Big Sweety. And I always chuckled when I heard that and thought of her. So God's first name is a subject of much discussion. It always has been. And people have fought wars over it, which is very sad, but they have. It would be much better, it could have been much better if people simply acknowledged that it exists and that it's immanent. But in those days, people didn't think of it as immanent. They thought about it as up above. So you come in this teaching, you realize there's power, the power is in you, and you can use it. And if you know that, you have to come to the obvious conclusion that this power doesn't play favorites, It's equally in everybody. Remember, its circumference is nowhere. Its center is everywhere. Its center is in every one of you. Each of you are individualizations of it. There's not a spot where God is not. And then I've got to tell a bad joke from my friend, Reverend Celeste. She asked the question, is its name Harold? You know, in Our Father's, the Our Father. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. I had to do that. Or is it, it is a bad joke, right? I said I'd do it anyway. Or is it in Andy, in the gospel song? You know Andy, right? And he walks with me, and he talks with me. Sorry for those jokes. I'll only do them once every couple of years. Dr. Holmes opens our textbook with the whole chapter entitled The Thing Itself, and he capitalizes throughout the text many synonyms for God. Here comes yet another list from our glossary. I didn't write it all down this year. You can go to the glossary. You'll see many, many, many names. When you hear the phrase God consciousness, it's a way that we talk about our self-knowing mind, that part of us that knows that we are one with the universe, the whole. And when this happens, we are aware that we are one with, I'll say, God. We come to realize that we are a center of God consciousness and some part of the consciousness of God. Now, if I want to borrow from William Edelin, who I love usually everything he's written, this thing called God, we learn about, he was quoting Albert Einstein. Einstein said, the teachers of religion must have the stature to give up the superstitious images of a personal God out there somewhere. That was Einstein in his lifetime. Because he said, otherwise you can lose it all. He says, because no one's going to buy this stuff forever that people have been peddling. So the teachers of religion of the future must have the stature to give up the superstitious image of a personal God out there somewhere. Now you can have a personal relationship with it, right? He's not saying that, but the idea that it's a guy or it's a woman and, you know, and all of that you can manipulate it and all of that, we got to give that up. Alfred Whitefield, famous for a type of philosophy called process philosophy, advanced the idea of this interconnectedness that we have, describing how all of our personal choices and actions have far-reaching consequences in the world. There's an interconnectedness that we all have. So as I get myself together and lift myself up, I'm unknowingly helping other people all around me. You know, you've heard, one boat, you can lift up the whole harbor. Our teaching teaches us to be focused on ourselves, and we do our work in consciousness, we do our work in mind, and as we do, we're lifting up other people. The old way is we're going to go out and help everybody, and we're going to try to change people, and that's always a waste of time. And usually, you have so much that you have to do on yourself, and you don't realize that if I just got myself right, I'd be improving all my relationships everywhere. He said, who am I quoting here now? Whitehead. The most important single question facing modern human beings is, what do you mean when you use the word God? The word or the idea of God is a symbol of something that you know deep within you. And all language is symbolic. What do you mean when you use that word? So if you want to talk about that at break, we can. For tens of thousands of years, human beings have searched the heavens for something, that we call God. At least 50,000 years ago, civilizations have been using every type of thing named. Before that, you can go back to the Neanderthal. For all these years, people have stood in awe before the mysterious forces of nature. Thunder, earthquakes, forest fires terrified them. They asked, why is this happening? Through those eras, people were assuming spirits were animating the trees, the animals, the wind, the storms, and you've all read how people approached sun gods and the gods of the crops and every other thing. Since these gods or spirits had power, they thought they sought to gain their favor by offering gifts, their crops, sacrifices of plants and animals. Much later, the gods were thought to live on sacred mountains, whether it be Mount Sinai or in Egypt or Mount Olympus in Greece. The gods were mostly in the mountains and going down from time to time to earth to sometimes have children and everything else that you've ever read. Over the centuries, humans created new gods to meet the challenging needs of the people. When the Hebrew nation was engaged in much fighting, their god was warlike, a god of a nation, a god who would help them in battle and bring them victory. Later, when their god was proved to not be as powerful as their opponent's god, they had to devise a god to meet new demands. Perhaps a god of mercy and compassion for these chosen people. Once again, God was created and changed in the minds of the human beings to meet a different time and a different need. Many Orthodox Judeo-Christian congregations still are burdened with the debris of archaic images and practices that cause people to leave these congregations. People are leaving churches from coast to coast in America. Most of the churches of Europe have already closed. Any religion or spiritual system or practice that stubbornly adheres to traditional theology and dogma is hopelessly at odds with the enlightened discovery of scientific findings. And they're destined to close eventually. To be alive as a spiritual community, you have to be finding ways to meet the next generation, the needs of the present, and certainly the future. Isaiah, which you don't usually hear me quoting, said, "All of our graven images are vanity." We have work to do as a spiritual community. We have work to do ourselves. We are interconnected beings. What everybody does and is doing is important to the whole. Many of us still today make images in our minds of some God out there who plays the role of watching everything we do, right or wrong. I'm here to tell you this power isn't watching. What this power is doing is it's responding to you. It responds to what you dwell upon. If you're dwelling on positive things, if this is your practice, keep seeing the God in the good, like Edwina Gaines used to talk about. If you're dwelling on positive things and you're really becoming a practitioner, you're seeing the good, the God. If you're seeing joy and love in your conversations, you are rewarded in so many ways. In our quest for spiritual maturity, it's important that we understand our own habit of anthropomorphizing or creating an external God through our imagination. In many spiritual centers and churches all over, God is still presented as something out there, separate and apart from us and the rest of creation. Ernest Holmes said, "There's power for good in the universe, of which you are a part." So he's really saying it's there, but you're part of it, and you can use it. Most traditional ministers and priests and rabbis tell people about God. They talk about what it wants. Think about that. The preacher's telling you about what God wants, what God expects, what God likes, what God dislikes, what God loves, what God hates. Hope you never hear me say anything like that. Bill Edelin, the columnist, goes on. They talk about what movies, what books that God wants us to be reading, and so on and so on. And it's like a lot of absurdities that get piled upon one another. I remember when I was a kid, my father owned 3 movie theaters and a couple other businesses. And the Monsignor was always telling my father what movies he could play. If you can imagine. That was when I was a kid, so it's a few years ago. But The churches are telling you, what can be watched, what can be read, at least back then. Maybe it's not so bad anymore. These people have all these notions, these priests and preachers. They can't tell you how to do anything. But in a second, they'll tell you with authority all about the mystery and the mysteries of what's behind a million galaxies and all that. The difference today is nobody's really buying any of that anymore. You're not buying it. I'm not buying it. It's impossible for us to understand how multitudes still could be hanging on to this archaic and primitive belief system. Each of us are humans. We're attempting to describe the creative source. The scriptures are loaded with such examples. Again, we say God loves, God forgives, God judges, is jealous, is angry, and so on. And all that stuff, most of us have let go of. We transfer here, Ernest Holmes, we're transforming a human emotion to a supernatural it, a presence, because that presence responds to us because it has to. That's the thing about, if you ever watched the movie The Secret, they had the big genie in the sky, your wish is my command. We understand here that life responds to it. Life responds to us because it has to. When we think of a God out there, God in creation, as though God is something apart from anything else, when we do that, then we're praying to some type of God who plays favorites and who favors some and saves some and condemns and punishes others. It simply can't work that way. So if there's a God out there, a God that we have to pacify with gifts, or a God that gets hurt feelings or gets angry if we don't please them. So is this a God of anger, jealousy, and vindictiveness and malice? No, we don't have that. Throughout history, dogma in all these churches, really most of them, has fought a losing battle. So Edelman was saying all that stuff has to end. Joseph Campbell said, these types of belief systems become, the buildings that survive will become the museums of tomorrow. In history, dogma in churches has fought a losing battle. When you talk about the will of God in this way, the church has continually lost every encounter with astronomy, geology, anatomy, anthropology, biology, physiology, and psychology. It fought against Copernicus, Galileo, Darwin, Pasteur, Ben Franklin, and all of the people who were defying the beliefs of their time. If there is an all-powerful God out there, then nothing contrary to that God can occur. How can anything be against God's will that's done on earth in that system? How can anything be outwitting, outsmarting, or outmaneuvering an omnipotent God in that system? It would be a logical impossibility. So this is Einstein, this is Edelman. They're all saying truth. Scientific truth will always prevail over superstitions, always prevail over old and fearful religious doctrines. So we might say, how could these religions, and how could my parents and grandparents even, have believed all these things for so long? The church, when I was younger, banned Pierre de Chardin, one of the great minds of our time, a Jesuit archaeologist and anthropologist. He was banned, all of his writings, and they proclaimed him a heretic. And there's been many, many others. Our statements and beliefs about God's will are all questionable. Here's an example I've used once before. A child, for example, is killed by a car. People will say it was God's will. Do you really believe this? More likely, the child was killed because someone was texting on their phone, or impaired. They had too much to drink or something and ran a stoplight. A driver killed the child. This wasn't God's will. Did they think that there was some kind of sadistic God above sitting up there saying, today I'll let this kid die? Or there's a child that perhaps has, say there's a young man named Jason. He got leukemia. Or in war, a family loses a son or a daughter in a bombing. Is that the will of God? No. It's more the madness and the aggression of the leaders who were involved in the whole planning of the war. It's more the madness and the aggression. Human beings die due to the acts of other human beings and of nature. Nature does a good number on us too. Things like hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes. Such are the activities of the universe, of the cosmos. To say that God killed somebody by a flood or anything else is ridiculous. It somehow diminishes God, it diminishes it. Human beings die from human ignorance and stupidity, from incompetence and carelessness, from disease, never from God's will.